Typically, the people who we may call mentally or psychologically enslaved are people who desperately attempt to adhere to the standards and expectations of their society. And these people are indeed enslaved. They are restricted and they are controlled. The society imposes norms and restricts and controls the individual, both internally and externally. They are kept from being their truest, freest, and happiest selves. Social standards and expectations crush their liberty. Internal and external forces hold massive influence and coercive power, forcing the individual to fit a mold rather than undergo a process of self-actualization. This does represent the enslavement of the mind. It is, however, important to not forget that the mind can be enslaved in another way as well. Vigorous and unrelenting contrarianism is as much a hallmark of mental slavery as any desperate conformism. It is simply the opposite form of mental enslavement. The individual restricts and controls themselves. In attempting to constantly rebel, they enslave themselves once again. They escape one slavery and step into another. The mindless contrarian defines themselves and their identity by their opposition to the norm, just as the conformist defines themselves and their identity by their adherence to the norm. It is just a different form of mental enslavement. They are both enslaved by the same norm, just in a different way. The contrarian desperately restricts and controls themselves to maintain a state of perpetual rebellion, just as the conformist desperately restricts and controls themselves to maintain a state of perpetual normality. Just as the conformist does, the contrarian lives desperately attempting to adhere to standards and expectations. They don't do what they want to do. They don't self-actualize. They recognize the same social system the conformist does, and somehow trick themselves into thinking they are bold and brave as they find a new way of enslaving themselves. In desperately trying to break with the norm for the sake of it, they reveal that they are still enslaved by it. When your core motivation is unique and radical contrarianism, you are just as enslaved by the norms of your society as any conformist. You literally live according to the same standards. Your behavior is dictated by the exact same expectations and standards, just in a different way. You are not an identical form of slave, but you are a slave nonetheless. In desperately attempting to demonstrate their liberty, the mindless contrarian reveals that they are simply subject to a different form of slavery. The slavery of contrarianism rather than the slavery of conformism. The follower of yet another restricting and controlling creed. We should not conform for the sake of it, just as we should not be contrarians for the sake of it. We should move beyond these two varieties of mental enslavement. We should act as we truly want, regardless of whether that makes us conformists or contrarians. Be a conformist when you want, and be a contrarian when you want. That is the only way to move beyond the restricting norms central to our society. We should seek to crush the influence of oppressive social expectations and norms, regardless of what form they take. We should pursue self-actualization and abandon these unnecessary restrictions. We should advance beyond conformism and contrarianism.